Hi, I'm Ryan Szymanski, curator for Battleship New Jersey Museum and Memorial, and today we've got, I'm going above and beyond answering a question that a number of you have asked. Can the battleships be brought back into active service, or in what order would the battleships be brought back into active service? And I'm going to answer that as which museum ships could or should be brought back, and what order would I do that in? First, here's a word from the museum.
I am Vice Admiral Retired Doug Katz, and I served as the commanding officer of the USS New Jersey from 1987 to 1989, when we deployed in '88 to represent the United States at the Olympics in Korea and for the Australian Bicentennial. Talk about an honor and privilege. This ship rose to the occasion in every respect and made a lasting impression during that period. Frankly, it just didn't get any better than that. I am here to ask you to consider donating whatever you can to the battleship to keep her looking as we all remember, from World War II through the 90s to the great museum she is today in Camden, New Jersey. Thank you all, and all the best.
So, before we get started, the Navy does not own any of these museum ships. Constitution and Nautilus are both still owned by the Navy. While they are commissioned vessels, Nautilus has her nuclear reactor moved, so she cannot generate her own power or propulsion. And Constitution, of course, is a sailing ship, so she's not generating any electrical power. They would not be high on my list for bringing back for military service. The Navy doesn't own any of these ships. They could not just show up one day and take the ship over. In theory. In practice, if there was an extreme national emergency and bringing back the battleships could save lives, or adding another carrier to the fleet, an extra flight deck, would help, we probably wouldn't say no to the U.S. government if they showed up and said, hey, we need Battleship New Jersey for World War III. Like, great, we're finally going to get more Battlestars than Enterprise. So every time that the Iowa-class battleships in particular have been recalled to active duty, it was from the mothball fleet. They were still owned by the Navy. And the Navy has never, to my knowledge, pulled a museum ship out of active service. The closest that they've ever come was the museum battleship Oregon, a pre-dreadnought from the Spanish-American War, which was set up as a museum in Oregon, and then the people of Oregon gave her back to the Navy during World War II. She was demilitarized under the Washington Naval Treaty in the 1920s, and so had zero value. So the Navy was just going to scrap her for metal. And by the end of the war, they still hadn't done that, and she ended up slipping her moorings on the way to the scrappers in like the later 40s and drifting around the Pacific for a while. But she was never reopened as a museum. She was eventually scrapped. And that was a huge loss. That was a ship of no military value. And that is probably a bigger possibility than reactivating these ships. A number of former Navy vessels are in what the Navy considers to be critical condition. Look at the submarine Ling, for example, where she sunk at her moorings and does not have a functioning museum that's open to the public running her. There are volunteers raising money and trying to restore that vessel, but she's not operating in any way, and she can neither be towed out to dry dock, according to some estimates of the river levels there and the bridge levels, and she is sinking, and any fluids that are being pumped out of that boat contain hydraulic fluid and other stuff that probably shouldn't be pumped into the Hackensack River, and yet these volunteers are doing it. So there are ships like that the Navy looks at, and they say, so far they have just stepped away and not wanted to get involved at all. If the Navy steps in, then they have to spend money to remediate asbestos, lead, and PCBs and hydraulic fluids and oils and stuff. On their way to scrapping these vessels, they might have to strip away part to get them under bridges and whatnot. The Navy was running the museum destroyer Barry, and then when a new bridge was built, they decided that the easiest thing to do was to cut off her mast and drag her to the Philadelphia Navy Yard here on her way to being scrapped, which I believe she has since gone to Brownsville. So if a ship cannot be dry docked, the Navy considers it to be in critical condition. And a number of museum ships are sitting in the mud. However, the Navy, unless they already own the ship, have not stepped in to help any ships in critical condition. If we got into another first-rate war and there were metal shortages for whatever reason, I could see them coming to museum ships and saying, hey, this is pre-nuclear steel. This is good armor-grade steel. We want to scrap it and use it in other things. That's possible. But that's not fun to think about. So this video, now that we're already 15 minutes into the video, we're going to talk about which ones, if I was the Navy, vote Ryan, Secretary of the Navy, if I was in charge, which ones would I bring back and in which order? So first, I'm just going to go through the 8 battleships. That tends to be where the questions focus. And then after that, if there's still any room left on the memory card, we will run through the carriers, the cruisers, some of the smaller ships, maybe even some of the submarines. And I'm just shooting from the hip, going from off the top of my head. I visited most of these vessels, and I've got an impression of what material condition they're in. And I think I know what I would look for were I the Navy in reactivating these ships. So first off, which battleship is the least likely to be reactivated? I'll give you guys a minute to make your own guesses. And Texas. Texas is arguably both the most historically significant from a design perspective. She is the last dreadnought-type battleship. And as the oldest vessel on this list, she's in some of the most critical material condition. Even though she's going to go into dry dock in the very near future, and that's going to address a lot of her issues, she has really antiquated steam expansion engines, which, if you think our steam engines are antiquated and not really in use in the modern Navy, hers are one step up from sails as far as a modern sailor's training would dictate. With the battleships, I do not consider it possible to change out the propulsion machinery. The propulsion machinery is in the armored citadel, which means you have a heavily armored deck overhead, a multi-layer bottom underneath, and there aren't any dry docks that act as car jacks where you put the battleship up and work on the underside. And they've got an armored belt on the side. So there's no cutting through that and putting in a nuclear engine. Stop suggesting it! So, for the purposes of this video, with the battleships for sure, we are not changing any propulsion machinery. So Texas being riveted hauled, having her hull largely wasted away, and being a very old hull form, it is tough to push that through the water. She is not hydrodynamically efficient by modern standards. She is state-of-the-art by World War I standards. A little bit obsolete by modern standards. So Texas is at the bottom of my list, not just for material condition, because of her equipment. Next on my list are going to be the 2 South Dakota-class battleships, Massachusetts and Alabama. These 2 ships are operating effectively as museums. They have had something like 60 years of work modernizing them. Alabama is sitting in the mud. Massachusetts is free-floating. Both ships have had some of their internal fittings stripped. Otherwise, are fairly intact. They use a similar sort of steam turbine propulsion equipment to the Iowas. The main reason I'm ranking these at number 6 and 7 to bring back is because they're small. In order to get the armored immunity zone that the Navy wanted. They really compressed these ships, which did not impact their fighting qualities at all. They were able to up the propulsion machinery to maintain the same speed as the other fast battleship class that came before them, the North Carolinas, that we'll get to in a minute. But their living and working spaces are more cramped. And so when you're talking about adding new equipment, I think these ships come out second best to the North Carolina, who is going to be our next one. So these ships, even though they're more modern than North Carolina, I think have less room to put modern systems. You can probably put some Sea Whiz in the superstructure. I'm not sure where you put the Tomahawks. Maybe you have to remove a gun turret and put in vertical launch tubes. Well, that gets rid of your whole purpose of bringing back a battleship, which is to have 16-inch guns for shore bombardment. So I just don't think these ships have as much room as North Carolina, even though they're a little bit newer and a more modern design and a more effective armor scheme. So even though they would have a smaller crew, maybe even close to half what they would have had during World War II, I still think their cramped condition is going to restrict them. North Carolina was actually in commission a little bit longer than the South Dakotas following World War II because there was more room on her. The accommodations were better. She was only armored against the 14-inch guns, which she was designed to carry, even though she was upgraded to 16-inch. So less effective armor than the South Dakota class. But we're talking about reactivating these ships in the modern day, and there aren't any weapon systems out there that can defeat these armor systems as it is. At least not gun or missile systems, most likely. There are torpedoes and mines that could potentially defeat the torpedo defense system, but there isn't really any difference here. So North Carolina, a little bit older by a year or two, a little bit older design-wise. It would be a tremendous amount of work to update this ship, which basically still has mid-1940s era accommodations and equipment and fittings and anti-aircraft batteries and all of that. But if it's as much of an emergency as I'm talking about and they've got to bring back battleships, after I have reactivated the 4 Iowas, North Carolina is next on my list, followed by the South Dakotas, and Texas just isn't on this list at all. North Carolina does have enough deck area that I think that you could add box launchers for missiles or potentially even vertical launch tubes in the superstructure or fantail deck, possibly. But if you want to add missile systems, North Carolina is better to bring back than the South Dakotas. So next, which Iowas? I am going to say that Iowa is in the worst material condition of the Iowas. Not in a material condition standpoint, but because the damage to Turret 2 was never fixed. So Iowa is functionally only has 8 barrels. You can fix the center barrel for Turret 2 and bring her back up to 9 barrels, but I think it would be more work to do that than it would be to reactivate the other 3 Iowas. So I'm putting Iowa at the bottom of my list. The Iowas are still collectively my first choice for bringing back. Obviously, they've been in service most recently. They are the fastest. They can keep up with the carriers. They can get anywhere in the world as quick as a 57,000-ton ship can, which I think is great from a power projection point of view. If you're bringing back these ships, you need to be sending them to different hot spots, like Reagan used them for in the 80s. And these ships still fit through the Panama Canal, which a modern nuclear carrier does not. Interestingly, we are at best holding steady with the number of carriers we have. At worst, we are reducing the number of carriers we have. I just heard that Nimitz is going to be decommissioned in 2022. Presumably, Ford and then Kennedy will be coming online to replace Enterprise and Nimitz. but we're now replacing nuclear supercarriers. During the Reagan administration, we had 15 carrier battle groups, and he thought that wasn't enough. So the issue here is a battle group is only good for 1/3 of the time. 1/3 of the time it's doing maintenance, 1/3 of the time it's doing training, and 1/3 of the time it's actually deployed. So even though Reagan had 15 carrier battle groups, he only had 5 at any given time he could send anywhere in the world, which is why he created 3 battleship battle groups that would supplement him with an additional battle group ready to go at any time. So, in theory, the modern U.S. Navy is still operating that way, and if you're trying to bring back museum ships, then you probably need to project power in multiple places at once. It's not enough to send a carrier battle group because we've had another Pearl Harbor situation and some of our Nimitz have been knocked out, or because it's a world war again and we have to project power in multiple theaters simultaneously. And so that's why you're trying to bring back the battleships. Okay, so Iowa, I'm putting in last place because of the turret. The turret can be fixed. I'm saying that's going to be more work than reactivating any of the others. In actuality, all of these ships will require a massive amount of work. Probably rather than using the armored box launchers, vertical launch tubes would be installed in the superstructure, which involves raising the superstructure so they can fit and gutting a lot of the officer spaces up there and then having to find room for them lower in the ship. So we're talking about a massive amount of work to update these ships, even though they've only been out of service for 30 years at this point. Next on my list, I'm going to put Missouri. Arguably, Missouri is the most historically significant of the Iowas. Arguably, she has been operating the most effectively as a museum. But that gets into some issues. Because she has such high visitation, she has had, I feel, the most internal parts stripped, and also because she's so historically significant. So while she was in mothballs and now while she's a museum, people pry fittings off of the ship to take home as souvenirs. And so I'm going to say that drops her down to 3rd place among the Iowas, because you would have to find all of these little fidgety parts for all these compartments to bring back. Is that prohibitive? No. A lot of these parts the Navy still either uses or uses something pretty similar. And on the Iowas that still have all these parts, they aren't working by and large, so you'd have to rewire them largely to begin with. But that's why I'm going to drop Missouri to 3rd place. New Jersey I'm putting in 2nd place. Again, arguably the next most historic. She and Missouri were taken out of service first to be turned into museums, and Iowa and Wisconsin were intentionally chosen to be held in reserve. New Jersey has had modifications such as cutting through an armored barbette and cutting through bulkhead in an engine room that the Navy would have to fix before they return to service. These are museum-era upgrades that the museum did and the Navy approved of, but they would have to fix. And New Jersey has the most mileage on her, but she's arguably in the best material condition on the inside. And so I think if I absolutely had to pick a second Iowa to bring back, New Jersey would be the one. And she receives the least amount of visitors of the various Iowas. So we're losing the least from the tourism industry by bringing this one back. So the battleship I think the Navy would be most likely to bring back first is Wisconsin. Wisconsin was the last of the Iowas to be modernized, so she got the best modernization. She got updates that the other ones didn't, including a brand new teakwood deck, which none of the other Iowas have, including the largest CEC space, which I think will be important for these ships if they are going to be the center of battle groups if they're brought back. She got a number of other updates that the other ones didn't get. Some updates in the superstructure to enclose ladders and other things which are external on the other Iowas. She got a tensioning derrick for unrep transfer back aft on the starboard side near the refueling boom, and none of the other Iowas got that. I think if these ships were reactivated, they would all get some of these modifications that Wisconsin got, but because she was only brought back in '88, and then they started getting rid of Iowa and New Jersey in like the '90-'91 time period, and Wisconsin and Missouri were gone in '92. They never had time to make these updates in the other Iowas. Wisconsin has them. She would be the cheapest and easiest to bring back. She's in Norfolk. You can drag her right across the basin into the dry dock right there and start doing updates if you want to do that. Potentially, if we're in a shooting war, that dry dock is being used to build another Ford-class supercarrier, which would take at least half a decade, hence bringing back these Iowas. But if that's already in use, maybe you're towing her down to Pascagoula, where she originally got her work. But still, she's right there in the Navy Yard with Navy tugs that can pretty easily take her out. And Wisconsin has the lowest mileage of any of the Iowas. Throughout roughly a 50-year career, New Jersey was in service for 22 years, and Wisconsin was only in service for 12 years. The other two Iowas were in between. So she has the most life left to give, hence her being my number one choice for the battleships. Sort of adjacent to this conversation, though not quite relevant, I think, but I think some of you may have heard this and might bring it up in the comments, so I'll address it now. When Wisconsin and Iowa, which were retained in mothballs longer than New Jersey and Missouri, were finally authorized to be turned into museums, for the early part of their museum careers, they were still owned by the Navy. So that limited what spaces people could go into early on. So, for example, when Wisconsin was first opened up as a museum ship in Nauticus, in Norfolk, you could basically only walk around the main deck of the ship because functionally the inside of the ship was still being held in mothballs. And if the Navy ever needed the battleship for shore bombardment, they could walk right over there, grab her, and take her back, and everything's still mothballed, and she goes right back into service. Approximately 2009, this ended. So Wisconsin was able to then start opening interior spaces, and Iowa was turned over to be turned into a museum, period. So Iowa was the last one to be a museum. So now they've been able to go through and open interior spaces. In doing that, those two ships have much stricter EPA regulations on what they have to do before they open a ship than New Jersey and Missouri have, which have stricter regulations than any of the battleships that were opened as museums in the 50s and 60s or 40s in Texas's case. There basically are no restrictions. Asbestos, lead, PCBs, doesn't matter. You can walk in and open the spaces. On Iowa and Wisconsin, they are not as free to move around the ship as we are. They have to do stricter inspections before they can go into spaces. That doesn't really affect the order in which they'll be opened up. It's just some information that you guys might have heard that might make you think, is this still the case? Does the Navy still run those ships? Not for 12 years now. I believe that the battleships would be the first ones that they'd look at bringing back, because there is no ship currently in the Navy that can provide long-range gunfire support for amphibious operation. Would we or do we still do amphibious operations? We haven't since the first Gulf War, to my knowledge. We can pretty easily helicopter in troops at this point, which takes them over the fixed defenses at a beach and puts them somewhere inland that's less well defended. But because there is this gap in the Navy's lineup that is limiting the effectiveness of amphibious operations, I think battleships would be the most likely of the museum ships to be brought back. There is no backup plan. There is no design for a backup plan. The Zumwalts were supposed to fill that gap, but not as many Zumwalts were built as planned. And because there were so few of them, the super special long-range shells for their guns never materialized. They became too expensive for only 3 units, and so they cannot provide the naval gunfire support that the battleships could. I forget what the number is, but somewhere between 80 and 90% of the Earth's population lives within 20 miles of a coast. Well, shucks, that's about the range of an Iowa-class battleship's guns. So it means that most population centers, and therefore the factories and military assets and everything else for most countries we would end up going to war with, are within range of a battleship's guns. So I think there would be utility for reactivating a ship that could provide this sort of gunnery support that is cheaper than using an aircraft or a missile, and a 16-inch shell is a heck of a lot harder to shoot down than a missile or an aircraft, and you're not potentially losing a pilot. So that's why I rank the battleships first. Now let's say you don't want to bring back a battleship. Cruisers can provide naval gunfire support, and they can reach inland 12, 15 miles. And maybe we make a saboted round that can shoot even further inland for those cruiser guns. So what order do I want to reactivate the cruisers in? There's only 3 of them in America. This is going to be easy. And Olympia, much like Texas, I'm going to take off the table. She is too old, too historically significant, and even when she gets dry docked and gets her hull work done, her machinery can't be used anymore effectively, and she's already had one of her engines stripped out entirely, and she's a riveted, old-style hull that is not hydrodynamically effective. So Olympia's just out. I would say that with the cruisers, you might be able to change propulsive equipment because they don't have as much armor. It might be worth it to cut through there. But the other cruisers we have left, Little Rock and Salem, have pretty similar propulsive equipment to the battleships. So I wouldn't. The steam turbines work fine, and like I said in another video, the steam turbines can take shock after being hit. These ships are operating close to an enemy shore if they're providing naval gunfire support, so there's the potential for them to be hit. A nuclear reactor would scram if it took that shot. So I would say just leave them with the steam turbines they have. Next on my list is Little Rock. She's only got 1 6-inch gun turret. She does have some missile systems, but they're entirely antiquated. And at the top of my list of cruisers to bring back is Salem. Believe it or not, the Des Moines cruisers were in mothballs when the Iowas were in the 1980s, and the Navy looked at reactivating them with a similar modernization as part of the 600-ship Navy. Now, I suspect it was either we bring back the cruisers or we bring back the Iowas. And the Iowas have a greater reserve of buoyancy. We can do more to them, and there's nothing else in the world like them, so it becomes a big prestige thing. But let's say we don't want to spend all the money reactivating an Iowa. Salem is not a massive attraction in Massachusetts. She's competing with Battleship Cove, and she's a large ship, but nowhere near as heavy or expensive as an Iowa to maintain. There's a reason the 8-inch gun cruisers were kept in service longer than the Iowas. They were cheaper to run, and their 8-inch gunfire could provide a lot of shore bombardment support that a similar amount to the Iowas. It can't quite go as far without special upgraded munitions, but hey, why wouldn't you upgrade the munitions at this point? They never did for the Iowas because it was expensive, but they looked into it. And I suspect had the Iowas been in service for another 10 years like had initially been envisioned, that we might have seen saboted rounds and even guided munitions fired out of the 16-inch guns. Plus, the 8-inch turrets are automatic. They have a much higher rate of fire and require much fewer sailors to operate. So if you want gunfire support, Salem might be your answer. She does have the reserve of buoyancy to put on some missile systems, and she's got the room to put on anti-air systems. You might have room to put in vertical launch tubes. You could definitely put on harpoons or armored box launchers, even though those are obsolete systems. So that gets us through the surface gunfire support. Let's roll into flight decks. So the Navy wants to get back up to 15 flight decks for this World War III that we're hypothetically talking about. Which carriers do we bring back first? Well, I'll go through in the same order. Last place, I'm going to put Yorktown. Yorktown is sitting in the mud, and she has holes along her wind water line because she's been a museum so long. So you'd have to dredge her out and then patch those holes. Next up, I'm going to put Intrepid. Intrepid was dredged out back in the 90s when she was last dry docked. Because of the way water and silt moves there, she's probably been mudded in again, so you have to dredge her out. But Intrepid has done the most work, probably of any museum ship, to remove the shipboard components and replace them with museum components. So I would consider her the least complete on the inside of the carriers for sure. So you would have to add a lot of internal structure back before you're landing jets on the flight deck again, and you'd have to reinstall a ton of interior features. Next up, I'll put Hornet. I think she is probably the only one of the Essexes that's still free floating. I've never been on her before, so I can't tell you too much about her material condition. In the number 2 spot for the 5 carriers, I'm going to put Lexington. Lexington was in service up till 91 as a training carrier. And even though she's sitting in the mud, she has been in use the most recent, and so I think she could be reactivated the most easily of the Essexes. But by far, the most useful of the carriers to bring back to active service is Midway. Midway was in service into the mid-90s. Her flight deck, although a little bit smaller than the modern supercarriers, she's just one step below the true supercarriers, can still handle modern jet fighters. And she's the largest of these carriers. She could provide a maybe second-tier carrier option if a situation doesn't require a full modern nuclear carrier battle group. And if we had to expand the number of carriers we had quickly, 5 years to build a new one, 4 or 5 years to build even if you wanted to take, say, an America-class amphibious transport ship, the Gator freighters. It takes a long time to build them, even if you're updating one to carry aircraft, true fixed-wing aircraft and not vertical takeoff aircraft, which the CVL concept is one that comes up from time to time, and they usually start looking there. I think it would be easier to bring back Midway than it would to reactivate one of them. And the Navy has almost gotten rid of all the conventional carriers that they have. We've still got Kennedy over here. She's going to go down to Brownsville any minute now. And I think the West Coast still has Kitty Hawk, and she's going to go to Brownsville any minute now. And all the other super carriers that are conventional powered are gone. So first class shooting war starts out, they won't be here to reactivate. So because the Navy is keeping less ships in mothballs, maybe they would have to pull a museum ship like Midway. So let's get down to some of the smaller vessels. The submarines, off the top of my head, them all, some are sitting on dry land, and I'm going to say that those probably aren't going to come back to active service. Some are still floating and in various states of repair. These are all World War II era vessels, and the fact that they're diesel electric is interesting. The Navy exclusively has nuclear-powered submarines these days. Diesel electric submarines can theoretically run quieter than a nuclear submarine. However, these are old-style World War II hull forms. I don't think they would be that quiet. I don't think there's much utility in bringing these back. Let's say it's an actual emergency and you got to bring them back. Some of them received more modernization than others, the Guppy programs and the fleet snorkel conversions. So those are the ones I would start with rather than the ones like Ling that are still in their World War II configuration, or Bofin, or COD, or Cobia. In terms of the destroyers, we've got a couple of them around. They are not of much value as destroyers anymore. And I'd put them all around the same tier. If you need a patrol vessel, and you can potentially put any submarine sonar and torpedoes on any of these vessels, I'd say they work one just as well as the next. Orlik and Joseph P. Kennedy are both frammed and pretty modern. USS The Sullivans and Kidd and Case and Young are older Fletcher class that are still closer to their World War II configuration than the modernized gearings. If you really wanted to bring a ship like this back as a patrol vessel, maybe you'd look at Slater. Slater has been maintained in pretty immaculate material condition and is the most recent of any of these vessels in military service. She was still used by the Greek military up into the 90s. And she was never mothballed. She was more or less just given to the museum. And so even though her propulsion machinery doesn't work now, it doesn't all work now. It could be brought back online probably with the most ease. Hidden Sea, I don't think we would bring back a foreign-built vessel just because we don't have the spare parts to reactivate that or maintain it. So we've got a couple of Russian diesel-electric submarines as museums, and they are more modern than our World War II boats. But we don't have the parts to restore them. So I'm going to take them off the list. I'm going to take Hidden Sea off the list. Some vessels that would be interesting to bring back would be my beloved 327 class cutters. Taney and Ingham are both museum ships right now. They would be interesting to bring back as patrol vessels. They are a pretty robust design. They've got a large reserve of buoyancy. They are pre-war gold platers, so their hulls are a little bit thicker. So even though they're older, I would dare say that their shell plating is thicker to this day. Because the 327s were built as Coast Guard cutters and patrol vessels, in addition to being warships, I think they have the most utility of any of these vessels. They are very seaworthy vessels. Even though they're slower than Navy destroyers, they're significantly more seaworthy. There's a reason these ships were used for ocean weather stations for decades. They can weather storms that would sink contemporary destroyers. Are you interested in reading more about using museum ships as warships in the future? There's no book about it. It's one of those subjects that I've long thought about writing on. But there is a series of books from the 1980s in which they pull World War II vessels out of mothballs to turn them into active vessels again. The series is by Peter Albino, and it's the 7th Carrier series. And the whole crux of that series of, I think it's 11 novels, is the Chinese put a series of satellites in orbit which laser any jet engines. So any missile or jet aircraft that takes off is destroyed by these satellites. And so the various countries bring back a lot of their World War II era vessels, including New Jersey. She features heavily in the series. And use these vessels alongside World War II era propeller planes, largely because they have old-style anti-aircraft guns that are more effective than the modern ships which rely on missiles, which could no longer be used. Thanks for watching, guys. Which museum ships would you bring back first? Let me know in the comment section. Do you agree with what I said, or do you have some different opinions of things? Battleship New Jersey receives operating support from the New Jersey Department of State, and also from a number of public and private institutions, including viewers like yourselves. Your support allowed us to go from making 1 video a week to making 5 videos a week. There's a link in the description where you can donate, and be sure to like, share, and subscribe so that you're notified when we put out new content like this. Thanks for watching.